We only had 1 week to make this game happen, and to be honest, I wasn't sure we were going to be able to do it. James and I have been working on Orbital Abyss Cipher Division for a little over a year now, and to be honest, we're starting to feel like the dad from Coraline. That's when we saw it, like a shining light on the horizon. The very serious JuniperDev game jam popped into our recommendations. James and I looked at each other, and we knew we had to make something for it. The theme was announced, and we got to work. One of our main goals with this project was to familiarize ourselves with Godot's 3D capabilities in preparation for our next project. We discussed a few different genres and types of games that we could make for the jam, and ultimately decided on a plan. We would be making a 3D platformer. Then the question arose, what kind of world would we be able to make if we only had a week to make it? We decided that the main area of the game should be a tower that the player would have to complete a series of jumping puzzles to climb. And with a plan in mind, we got to work breaking the ice on Godot's 3D capabilities. For day one, we spent most of our time doing something we never did in historical game jams or projects in general. We made a plan. Features were separated into 3 categories: minimum viable, planned features, and wishlist features. Minimum viable were things we knew we absolutely needed to release the game. Things like jumping, character controls, the tower itself, and of course platforming puzzles. Then we worked to list features that would make the game more of a game. With the jam's spin to win theme in mind, we discussed a few types of platforms that we could create. We envisioned large gears that the player could interact with to spin into a position so they could complete the platforming puzzle. We also discussed a screw platform that would rise and spin along the thread of the screw pole. Unfortunately, the spinning platform itself caused some issues with the character controller, so to fix that, we settled on spinning the screw pole itself instead of the screw platform. The wishlist category was where we really allowed ourselves to throw in any features we thought we wanted but weren't sure about. We had originally planned for a double jump and a dash that the player would unlock as you ascended the tower. However, we ultimately decided not to include these. The rest of the day was spent with me relearning how to work in Blender, and James working to create the foundation of our game. Day 2 was the most intensive day of the jam, and the day where I really began to wonder if we were in over our heads. While the foundational systems were laid, there was almost nothing concrete to show from our efforts for the previous day. In line with our minimum viable plan, we began by making the platforms. Alongside the gear and screw platforms we already showed, we developed a few variants of timed platforms which fall after the player stands on them for some time. We also created these hovering platforms, which can be used in a variety of ways. Now with our variants created, we decided we would use these pieces to create the puzzles within our game. We wanted there to be some way for the player to interact with the world and control when certain platforms moved. We discussed using switches, levers, buttons, but ultimately arrived at using a power plug as the source of control. When connected to terminals, this plug can move platforms within the world. That, and the plug happens to be the core plot point of the game. It's possible that if you don't get the plug to the top of the tower, the entire world as we know it might disintegrate. It's unclear. It is also the center of a hilarious joke James and I built the entire game around in a state of sleep-deprived madness that can only be achieved during a game jam. More on that later. I got to work modeling the plug and the plug terminal within Blender, while James built the functionality for the player to interact with objects. I really like how the Edison-style bulb on this plug turned out. It's one of my favorite assets in the game. With the platforms and the plugs working, and the day a little more than halfway over, we began work on the tower itself. We knew from the beginning we would be using a tile-based system to create the tower. I initially made a floor and wall tile, only to discover that Godot will not allow you to place 2 assets within the same grid unit using their tile map editor. We fixed this by combining the floor and wall assets into one asset. Here's one of the areas where I actually messed up. The wall is meant to be 6 units wide by 6 units tall, but it's actually 6.5 units tall because I messed up the positioning when joining the floor and the walls. It caused some problems when James went to actually build the tower, but by that point it made more sense for him to just change the units than for me to correct all the art. Now that we had proof of concept for the tiles working within Godot, I got to work in adding details and creating variants. One of our initial goals for this project was to test out texture baking. My understanding is that texture baking basically allows you to create a high detail model and then project that detail onto a model with less vertices. This technique can be used to make your models appear much higher poly than they actually are. However, after watching a couple of tutorials, it turned out to be much too ambitious an undertaking to learn how to do the texture baking and finish making all the tiles for the tower. I abandoned my texture baking ambitions and instead used a simple texture atlas so we could have almost all of the textures for this game contained within a single image. With that sorted, I worked to create the complete tile set. I made a few variants of the walls and the floors for the spire. I feel it's enough to create a level of variety while still being manageable to build. I also worked to create ramps and ledges. We ran into some more optimization issues with these ramps. I had the pivot point positioned so these ramps would nicely snap to the outside of the walls. They did, but they weren't in the correct place when James started placing them on the inside of the spire. Though not the most optimal choice, we ended up just duplicating these assets and moving the pivot point so that they could easily snap to the inside walls of the spire. After a very long day indeed, we finally had the platforms and tower pieces finished. Now all that we have left is to build the entire game. Pretty much the entirety of day 3 was spent building the tower, jumping puzzles, and then testing them. We ran into a couple of items that needed changed with the tower tiles, and I was able to change those. And now for some notes from James on his experience.
I got to work implementing the tower tiles using the 3D grid map tool within Godot. This was my first time using the tool, and it was far from a pleasant experience to say the least. Some features such as light baking would come back to haunt me later in the project. However, I was able to eventually produce something playable and moved on to implementing other features.
James also requested that we make these roof tiles, which I feel add a lot to the game. After spending the entire day and night building the tower, we finally had a playable version of the game. Day 4. Now assured that we would definitely be able to finish the game, we got to work on some of the more fun features that really brought the game to life. I got to focus on something that I've been really looking forward to, making the character. We wanted to have a simplistic design that was inspired off of the Overcooked character art. James did the animation for the character within Godot. My favorite part is that he made him spin while he jumps, which is both on theme as well as super cute. All in all, I think the character's cute and turned out pretty well. Moving back to the tower, James continued to fine-tune the level design to ensure the puzzles were challenging while still being solvable. It was at this point he built and implemented a checkpoint system so that you wouldn't lose all your progress if you fell off the tower. Now back to James with some notes on the work in the engine.
I began work on the checkpoint system. I wanted it to be very easy to set up so that we could add or remove as many as we wanted without fighting the system along the way. So I got started on a decoupled system that allowed us to simply place the checkpoint object into the game world and have the checkpoint manager figure out which order they should be displayed in the UI based on their y-axis level. This was achieved by adding all of the checkpoint objects to a group inside the Godot editor. Then in the code, I got a reference to all the nodes in that group, perform a simple sort operation based on the value of the Y position for each node, going from lowest to highest, and then finally add a UI element to the screen that allows the player to select it, teleporting the player to the new location. Then the checkpoint can be used by activating it with an activator object, which unlocks it and then allows the player to pick which floor they want to go to. I then added a feature to retrieve the plug item at any checkpoint, just in case you lost it on the way up the tower. At first we only had a few checkpoints here and there. Once we tested the game, however, we found out it was not very fun to lose a lot of progress if you fell all the way to the bottom. This may have been more fun in a rage bait style game, but we wanted it to be a bit more chill and completable within a short amount of time for the game jam.
Day 5. James pulled another all-nighter on day 4 to make the progress for this day possible. I awoke that day to an NPC dialogue system, an opening cinematic cutscene, and an original song all made by James. James and I then set to work writing a basic story for the game that centers around that sleep-deprived joke I mentioned earlier. The story starts you out with a quick introduction from the only other character we had time to create, Sir Sirius. He acts as a pseudo-tutorial, teaching the player about the plug item and giving them their goal of reaching the top of the spire. You come across Sir Sirius a few more times while ascending, and he teaches you a little bit more each time you meet him. The finale of the game, of course, is that you take the shame plug to the top of the tower to receive your reward. An advertisement for our new game, Orbital Abyss. Get it? Shameless plug. We also worked on lighting and creating a basic environment to surround the tower. I made 3 variants of trees as well as a basic landscape. Here's some more info on the process from James.
Here I learned about Godot's multi-mesh geometry nodes. These nodes are a great way to use the same mesh over and over with only a minor hit to performance. I used this node to spread trees and grass across the ground, making it feel a little less empty. I then attempted to hide some of the edges of the map with some post-processing effects such as volumetric fog. All in all, I think it came out looking pretty okay. I then moved on to lighting the interiors of the tower. Yes, this is where I found out I messed up earlier in the project. The 3D grid maps are very finicky when it comes to their mesh libraries, and require a lot of re-importing and sometimes even a complete reconstruction just to get some of the features to work, such as light baking. The mesh library I had been using for the entire project had never been updated, so I did just that, and well, the entire tower got destroyed in the process. I understood now what went wrong and how to avoid it in the future, but at this point in the project I was not going to rebuild the entire tower just to bake a few lights. So I ended up removing most of the lights and slimmed down the remaining lights by turning off shadows and adjusting culling distance to give us back some performance when they were not in view.
Day 6. Now the dialogue is complete, the shameless plug is primed and ready to be plugged in, and there's a world to look at. The game is really coming together at this point. We now work to create the finishing touches. We added some basic particles and sound effects, and tested the game before it was finally time to publish. We spent the remaining time we had honing our store page marketing skills. We created a few screenshots, some banner art tiles for the description, and a short trailer featuring the original song that James made, which you're listening to now. All in all, this was a great experience, and we appreciate the chance to get back to where it all started for us. JointPointStudios participated in our first game jam back in 2017, and it's crazy to see how far we've come from those janky little games. Our first full feature game, Alpaca Rancher, was released in May of last year, and while there is no official release date for Orbital Abyss, we are in the final stages of development for that game as well. Thank you to JuniperDev for hosting this jam, and for all the participants for building such unique and creative games. If you'd like to check out Orbital Abyss, our store page is live on Steam now. We plan to put more of a focus on development updates while working on our next project, so we can keep everyone posted on our progress and journey along the way. We hope you'll stay tuned for that in the future. Bye for now.